Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. What I'm going to talk about today is, I get a lot of questions. I work for the core machine learning group inside of Google. And so what we do is we basically build everything from helping applied solutions for different product areas like search, ads, maps, any of those groups, down to the frameworks and services. So that includes things like TensorFlow, TensorBoard, Keras, all that type of stuff. We also end up owning a lot of the way that people internally end up using accelerators, which are like TPUs and GPUs. And then we also do chip co-design, which is how do you actually lay out the TPUs of the future for future machine learning workloads. So the question I get a lot of the time, well, the first question I get is like, how should I use machine learning inside of my product? We're not going to talk about that today. We'll talk about it a little bit. But I get a second question from a lot of product managers, which is, how do I actually train up to be an AI product manager? And this talk is going to be a bit more about what is the reality of this rather than what is this perception that's starting to be built inside of the industries today. And so, maybe let's start first, like what does specialization even mean within the PM world, right? So there are definitely people that end up calling themselves platform PMs, growth PMs, that type of thing. But I think there's really like four main ways that we would end up talking about specialization. And so the first one is if we really require different skill sets, right? So if we require that in product management, I kind of believe that overall we have to be good at managing uncertainty. We have to be able to be good decision facilitators. We have to be able to build alignment. We have to be able to communicate. Those are skills that we build over time. And I would ask, like, for these specializations, do we require different skills in some way? The second thing is like competencies. And so skills and competencies I see as overlapping, but sometimes they're more meta in some way. I think that the different expectations about what you're supposed to do on your day-to-day job could mean that you're a specialization that's not just product management. And then finally, if you're in completely different organizations, right? So we work usually in cross-functional teams, managing up to some type of GM. Are you in a different ladder or a different kind of part of that organization as part of this? And so let's keep these things in mind as we start to talk about what does it mean to actually be an AI PM. When I first posted this talk, Frank works at Google as well. He works actually at Workspaces now. But he asked this really good question, which is, if we're going to talk about like the AI PM, is there such thing as an MVC framework PM, an HTML PM, or a NoSQL database PM? And I tend to agree. Maybe I don't want to give away too much of my talk. But I think we get caught up a lot of the time as product managers into the technical world that we're actually helping, when the reality is we are supposed to be more about customers, we're more supposed to be about outcomes, about the impact that we end up making, and that is almost rarely about the technology. It's very rarely about the technology. So I want to bring about a story from my background, which is really more about this emergence of mobile. So I worked at Kayak as a kind of hybrid BD and product person, brought in to help figure out the way that mobile would actually work for us. And this was at the time where desktop search for Kayak was starting to be eclipsed by mobile. And in fact, when I was there about a month and a half after that, mobile became a majority share of usage within Kayak. And within that world, we would see a lot of interesting changes in behavior from the standpoint of that, like people were doing more searches, not just kind of in mobile in general, but per capita, they were doing more searches. And as we started to dig into why that was happening, right? I got hired as a mobile PM. We were trying to do all this very mobile specific stuff. What we started to realize once we connected the dots across mobile and desktop, and not just mobile apps, but also web, was that people were doing much earlier searches about the way that they were thinking about travel with mobile than they were with desktop, but they were not buying more travel. Because you own a mobile phone, it doesn't change the job to be done of a person wanting to get relaxation, go to a business meeting, or fly to a wedding or something like that. So it didn't change any of that. What it did change, though, is their accessibility to information, the way that they may use that information in an early stage to be able to make a decision. And so what I guess I realized was, after that experience, right, are there any mobile PMs in here right now, actually? Anybody with the title of mobile PM? Okay. So after a couple years, there was no such thing as the mobile channel. And in fact, what we started to realize was that it didn't matter which channel was actually part of. That's what omni-channel ended up being, by the way, right? Is that it didn't matter whether it was mobile or desktop or whatever. It was an experience for a person. And that's why we tend to find that actually the hierarchies within product management organizations tend to focus more either on products that are about a particular customer, or specifically, if there's multiple customers, you'll find that you start to think about that experience, less of like even a persona, but more of a journey. And so for me, this started to think about this idea of like specialization, especially around uncertainty. And so something I talk about a lot is this, I'm part of this project called the Uncertainty Project, which is really writing about decision making and strategy. Inside of this world of uncertainty, right, when we first get started on something, we're highly uncertain about the way that it should work. Most of the time today, though, right, we actually operate somewhere here in the middle. So we have to deal with the uncertainty of the world, the complexity of the world. We have to deal with these questions about like, what is actually going on? But it's certain enough that we can have our projects project managed, that we can actually release something, we can make an impact in some way. We're more likely to make good impact than we are ideally to make bad impact. But we're kind of in the middle right now if you're just a PM. I think this highly uncertain time frames when we're still trying to figure out the rules of how do we actually do something, like, and I'll talk about the nuance here. I think that's something I want to talk about in a minute, is just like, what is the nuance of AI and machine learning? But the reality is that this mobile PM, this AI PM, any of these types of PMs that are in highly uncertain areas, they're just on the way towards becoming just a regular PM. Now, there's another side of the spectrum, which is that I've worked for a lot of teams where there's almost zero uncertainty in what they're doing. They are a platform that has existed for many years. They need to fix bugs. They need to make sure that it has continued to be performant. They need to make sure it continues to work, right? There are no PMs in this world. Or if there are PMs, they're not doing very much, right? They're trying to find something else to build, basically. And so I just want to like say that like, when it comes to this AI PM, right, I don't think this is for a very long time is going to be a thing. I think for maybe a year or two at most at this point. But it's just going to be a PM. But that doesn't mean that there isn't nuance, right? There is always nuance in every context that we end up joining, right? Like every time that you join as a PM to a particular team, you need to figure out how you actually help the people within that team, rather than you just do the job, right? There's no such thing as joining a team and saying, here's exactly the framework we're going to use, here's the way we're going to do development, here's all the stuff I need from you, and just get out of the way. That person is always going to fail. And so let's talk a bit more maybe about the nuance within the AI PM world. And so what nuance is involved for right now, and there's really three things that I want to talk through. One is data, and what does that mean? Training, and what does that mean? And then finally, what do we talk about when we're talking about the experience that we're actually building for our customers and how that changes with AI and machine learning? So first, data. I think there's a couple key tenets that I like to talk about. The first one is really garbage in, garbage out. Right? Whereas before, we maybe had to worry about customer data actually creating a bad circumstance for our products, we're actually using data before customers get involved at all in some cases. And so creating and curating the right type of data is very, very important in this type of role. And this is where all of the bias, fairness, other types of responsible AI type of issues come out of, is through data most of the time. There's no such thing as a model architecture that will reduce bias. There's only data sets and the way that you end up training them that actually creates a fair or balanced model in a way that you feel is appropriate. And again, I want to be very clear here too, is that we talk about bias inside of the machine learning world, there's positive, negative, and neutral bias, right? Everything we do is biased in some way. It's just that, is it bad for the people that we're trying to solve the problems for or not? The next thing is actually finding the data is a really, really big issue. A lot of the time you may not have enough of it, and if that's the case, you then actually have to start creating it, and there's a lot of issues that start to come up around synthetic data and the way that we end up creating and curating that type of information. But the final thing I want to just bring up is this idea around like regulation and consent of collection. So this is something that qualitative user researchers have been dealing with for a very long time. Data is valuable. It is maybe the new oil, whatever you want to talk about it is, but also you don't want to like live around a lot of barrels of oil, right? It's toxic in some ways. And so you have to be very careful in the way that you end up actually collecting this data. And I think it's very much related to another thing that I think is kind of interesting. And again, we're kind of living in this world of hype around generative systems that can create text and images and videos and 3D models just from like having something described to them. And so I'm an ex-consultant, so everything goes into a 2x2. I think there's only one other 2x2 in here maybe. But I want to talk about, like, when we talk about data, right, it ends up getting very weird when we start to think about possible futures. So this is something called a scenario planning exercise, where there's one very big uncertainty, which is something called embeddings, right? Embeddings are basically, once data has gone and trained a model, you have an embedding. And does this or does this not generate derivatives work? Which derivative work is a copyright term that means, is it different? Is it the same thing that was just created from something else? Or is it different enough that it's actually a new work? Or not? And then there's this huge issue about like explainability and interpretability within machine learning, which is, do we understand why the system is actually saying the thing it did? And so this idea of being able to link back to data that was actually training it, and so lineage issues, data tracking, all that type of stuff becomes an issue. And so this is meant to be more of an illustration about the craziness of how we now need to deal with like data within the machine learning world. And so the world we live in today, actually based on this 2x2, is right here. So anything goes with generated work, Midjourney, DALL-E, ChatGPT, GPT, they're trained on lots and lots of data that are considered to not be derivative works as embeddings. And there is almost zero explainability in why these things do this stuff. And so that's where we are today. But if we start to think about like the way that the future could start to unroll based on these different scenarios, we can start to get into this world where maybe prompt engineering, which is a way to actually create better text to have a machine learning system do something, if it is actually not a derivative work and explainability is good, you start to understand how all of this data actually impacts the output of the model in some way. And so you can then do a better and better job of curating the output of that model. But if we get into this world where embeddings are derivative works, you can get sued for using someone else's data, and there's no explainability, you then have to take what's referred to as a very data-centric model within the machine learning world. And so you have to curate all of your own data to be able to do anything, otherwise you get sued. And large businesses that create lots of data or have lots of data, like Disney, for example, they become very advantageous inside of this particular world. And then finally, like, if embeddings do generate derivative works and have explainability, you start to then get to a weirder place where you pay based on the inspirations that create this output model. And so this is just meant to kind of say that there's a lot of uncertainty right now about regulation of data in the first place, but also the fact is that there are many different places we can end up when it comes to the way we end up building things. And that's, like, I think, a very important kind of nuance around AI PM. The next thing I would talk about is training. And so whereas before you would write a specification or a PRD, and you would have engineering implement it, you'd have QA test it, you'd put it out into the world, and then you'd have customer support give you feedback, and you do analytics to be able to understand what's going on. Training doesn't work the same way. So, and by no means is the model the only thing, right? Like, but it is an important thing in the way that it sits in situ with the rest of the system itself. And so this is an image actually from Google Cloud. And it's a little washed out, but what you can see here is that there's lots of boxes at the very least, and lots of arrows, right? So it's a complex set of machinery. When we talk about training, though, and the way that the PM is actually involved, is it's not so much about specifying all of the behavior, but it's actually specifying the environment by which this model is being trained within. And so this first little circle right here is really about this idea of you're doing a bunch of loops to train a particular model. You're taking a data set, you're running it through the model, you're updating the weights, and then you're getting kind of a model that is trained once. You may do that multiple times over epochs to be able to, like, get a better and better model as time goes on. But then there's another loop here, which is that you may create many different model architectures, you may use different holdouts of data, you may do all these different things to be able to create many, many different types of models that you're then going to judge on how valuable that is. And so the PM there is still not necessarily doing their job, right? Like, we've talked about what data maybe goes into it, but what we're not talking about is, like, what does the evaluation actually mean here? And it's not just accuracy, it's not just ROC, it's not all these, like, things that end up being inside of the machine learning world, but we're not even at the point where we actually understand the impact on the end customer yet. So the next thing is really this larger model, which is you deploy things to the world, you get feedback from the world, you end up actually using that to then train better models. You have to detect things that's referred to as, like, drift, where you trained on a current set of data, but the world keeps evolving as time goes on, and so you may eventually drift away from the reality of the world with your model's performance. And so what we're doing as PMs is we're not actually specifying the exact behavior that this model should do. We're maybe putting guardrails around what it shouldn't do, but we're no longer specifying exact behaviors. We're actually creating environments by which these non-deterministic systems are being trained in some way. So that's an interesting difference, I think. And the last one that I'll talk about is experience. So from an experience standpoint, I've done a lot of work around kind of the intersection between things like design thinking and AI, the idea of human-computer interfaces, and what it ends up coming down to is that, these humans, when they use a system, they're actually using it to build a mental model about how they should understand or interact with that system. And we do that with everything. So if we're used to using a system, we have a mental model in our head. And this is very Don Norman, if people are familiar with that type of concept. But we're building these like cognitive artifacts to be able to understand what is going on with the system so we can use it. And this also includes non-deterministic systems, though. So like in deterministic systems where it will work the same way over and over again, we need to build new models as people to actually understand that the system may not always return the same thing that I expect or in ways that it may not expect it to behave. And so, it's very much dependent on trust into that system. And so we maybe have thought about trust in a very particular way when it comes to like regular systems, software, calculators, right? The trust we have in there is that they work the same way every single time, but trust is different when it comes to machine learning. And this is actually a very complex subject. So I'm by no means going to be able to help you solve all of your trust issues, but I can give you some pointers right now. So this is like a very important paper from 1997. Back then, the only things that were really non-deterministic systems or automated systems even was really the military, aviation, and then academic settings. And so Paris Surman wrote this paper, which is really about this idea of how do humans build trust models with the systems. And the key point about this particular paper is that it's not so much about building the most trust that you can have, but it's actually about building the right amount of trust, especially for non-deterministic systems. And so use means essentially that I'm going to use it when I should, I'm going to turn it off when I should. Misuse is that I use it all the time, even when I'm not supposed to. Disuse is that I don't trust it at all, so I don't ever use it. And then abuse is a very interesting one, which is that we didn't involve the actual operators of these systems to understand how they may interact with these models. And so it ends up being a lot about this like kind of how are we building and losing trust in the right ways so that we're keeping a steady place for where the trust should be for this non-deterministic system. And so there's a bunch of things that you can do to build trust. Right? You can communicate like the state of the system. You should understand what the operator is doing, what they have to do. You allow for intervention. You should not make stupid mistakes. Or if you do, you should just like try not to operate in those domains. And there's a bunch of things that we start to do to like actually build trust with these systems. So how do we build more interpretable systems to understand like how does this context of a non-deterministic system actually I understand it to build better models around that, helping me avoid human error rather than just trying to automate my job. And so I would just say like this idea around trust and the right level of trust is incredibly important when it comes to building these systems, even more important, I would say, than the deterministic systems. And maybe one like small plug for Google. I would definitely recommend checking out this People Plus AI guidebook. It talks a lot about this type of stuff, so definitely recommend that. But I think that's maybe the aspect that I've been most interested in is really this idea of how do we start to build the interfaces by which people understand these things better. And maybe as a PM, right, our job is not necessarily we're not supposed to make technical decisions, I would say that. And actually the most hated TikTok video that someone has of me is of me saying that PM should not be technical. And Apple user 135 very much thinks I'm stupid about this. But I think the thing that we need to be doing as product managers is really prioritizing this idea of discussions between tech and non-tech people. And at first, this was something that we could maybe do where we were pointing at customers or we were talking about like the way that they would actually get their job done, what are the outcomes that they're looking for. I think we get into like a weirder realm once we start to use these systems, especially things like generative systems, where there's not always the right use of this particular system for a particular use case. And so this was actually a really great LinkedIn post that I can send out to everybody later. But this is the idea of like for generative systems, so things like GPT, ChatGPT, Bard, all these systems that end up generating text. There are things that they can do very well that they require kind of like high fluency, which means simulation of English language or regular language. And then there's this idea of like accuracy or not. And so I think what we need to have better questions about, and I think there's some interesting things through kind of analogy, characteristics of problems, matched to technologies, things like that, which this talk is not going to be about. It's something I'm working on right now. But I think what we need to be getting back to is this concept of that, like, this technology is actually not fit for this particular use case. So even though it can synthesize language, probably it's not the best for travel recommendations because it needs to use factual data to be able to give you an actual travel recommendation. Or the idea of kind of like purchase recommendations about appliances, if it doesn't know about an appliance that just came out, how can it give you an appropriate recommendation? And so in those cases, we should be having a better discussion about like what are the characteristics we care about here. And so in this case, the characteristics that this particular article starts talking about is like how well should it simulate human language? How accurate does it need to be about the facts? And then how much of an impact would a mistake actually make on these things? So I think we need to have more of these types of discussions. And one way I've had this type of discussion is I did a workshop at South by Southwest. And I have an article that you can find online about this, but it was titled, you know, how does the Roomba really feel about dog shit? And the workshop was that we were trying to have discussions through what was referred to as animistic design and role play. But in particular, I want to talk about is this concept of role play. And so I've used this multiple times where we personify technology in a lot of ways. We shouldn't. We should try not to. But it also is much easier for us to understand the expectations between two human beings than it is for us to understand the expectations of a human and a machine. And so in this particular case, for this workshop, I had everybody pretend to be a Roomba or a Google Home Hub or something like that. And they interacted with each other, and the meat bags, which were these like really annoying people hanging out in the household, and the way that they would end up doing this. And actually the person who ended up playing the Roomba, they got the dog poop award, but they said that they were actually afraid of it. And that's interesting, right? Like, we don't necessarily need to say that Roombas should be afraid of dog poop, but they're not built to actually work on that issue. And so these types of technology discussions between humans become making much more sense when we start to like do things like role play. We start to have these trade-off discussions in a way that regular people, or at least stakeholders or subject matter experts, can now talk to the technical experts about these particular things. So I think just in closing, I want to make a suggestion to everybody here. I know that right now everything has to have AI in front of it. Even your job titles, probably. But I would, you know, can we actually just say experience instead and start to use that as the terminology rather than AI and machine learning and any other technical concept? And so I'll leave it there. Thank you. And I'll stick around for some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. That was really great. So some people are able to ask questions on Slido and some people can't, depending on who you are and who your cell phone provider is. Maybe you have service, maybe you don't. So first, does anybody want to put a question?
Does anybody disagree with me? Because I would love to debate you right now about it. So
yeah, there you go. All the hands just went down.
No. I'll take friendly questions too if that's what you want. So yeah.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So what kind of controversy do you see around the issues we were just talking about? Where does it kind of fall?
Yeah, I think like internally to my group, it's a highly technical group of people. Like some of these people have like PhDs in like material science. The problem is that they are still not technical enough for our engineering teams. And so I just think like that whole thing about like how technical should PMs be, that is the most controversial thing that I think I've ever talked about to anybody, basically. I still stand by the fact that like if we are making technical decisions for our engineering counterparts, they're not doing their job. And if we're doing their job, we're probably making a lot of mistakes, is what I would argue. Yeah. I mean, another question that I've gotten a lot too is like, how should PMs actually be using these technologies in some way? Yeah. And maybe really quickly, like, I don't think that actually, like, if your PRD can be written by ChatGPT, you're probably not really writing a PRD. I would just throw that out there. What I do think is valuable, though, is how do we use these systems to help us understand when our language is not being as clear or concise, how to help us summarize things better. Like I don't know if anybody's used Hemingway as an app, but it's a really great writing app. It's amazing because it shows you how horrible your writing actually is right now. But I think in general, that type of thing I think would be really helpful. How do we translate, right? Which one of these things about these types of systems that's really interesting is the ability to translate anything to anything in some ways. And again, not always accurately, but interestingly. And I think the other thing is that when we need to now think about like the ideation of new ideas, I've used this type of thing, and I write some short fiction stories and like role-playing game modules and stuff like that. But like if I ask for like 20 ideas, 10 of them are crap, 5 of them are okay, and then 5 are things I didn't consider. And so I think like from a PM perspective, we should be using these systems as agents that help challenge our own thinking. That's what I would say. That's maybe one thing I've been asked a question about. Do you have a question back there, or no? Any in-person questions right now?
There's one on
oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Say more about what you mean use experience instead of AI. Yeah. So if you have to put on your project like AI as like a feature name, it's probably not like a feature, is what I would argue. Like it's an AI, like an AI system is not a feature. What is a feature, or an experience in this case, is it's someone achieves some type of goal or solves some type of problem. It helps provide value to them that they hopefully give value to you back through some way, and it could be indirectly through like third-party markets or something like that. But the reality is like the experience that actually matters is your customer's experience. Chips do not have experiences. Models do not have experiences. People have experiences. And all that technology does is intermediate humans. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. I just want to make that very clear. So that's what I mean by experience.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Great. So the next question here is using AI to do your PM job cheating? Well, I don't think it's cheating. I think like there was a really interesting paper by, I think it's Ethan Mollick, who's out of, I can't remember which school, but he just did this post that was really interesting about how, for consultants at least, and again, you know, that's probably the big 4 are probably going to be the first ones that are fully automated, unfortunately, when it comes to consultancies. And I used to work for one of them, so I don't know. I think like it's much cheating, but it's that like the bar for everybody gets raised. Because when you're like, say, a bad writer, right, if you can get critique of your writing that is really helpful to make it more concise, if you can get it summarized better, if you can do all this stuff, right, the bar is actually raised for everybody. But for the people that are above that bar already, that are experts in some way, they're using the system as well to make their job better. I think the big question we have right now, maybe, and again, I'm kind of sidestepping your question because it feels like it's very leading. But like, I think that longer term, what's going to be really important here is that how do we help people gain expertise in something over time if certain aspects are automated? And this is a constant challenge with any type of system that is automated, right? So how do we keep pilots trained on doing emergency landing if all of their landings are automated? And so this is a constant tension within automation of any system, basically. And again, maybe referencing Don Norman here, talks a lot about like cognitive artifacts, and some of them are positive cognitive artifacts, like the idea of like an abacus, right? Like it actually teaches people can now do math in their heads just by doing hand signals to think about it, versus the idea of a calculator, which are offloading calculation, and you maybe are not as good based on that type of thing. So I think like there's a lot of things to say, especially because product management in general, as a skill set, as a competency, as a kind of a ladder within companies, is very much like focused on intuitive or tacit knowledge. And so at Microsoft, we used to say that program managers really weren't worth very much for the first 2 of their life. And the reason why was because they could do the job by the book, but they wouldn't have like the intuition about how and when to use the book, or how and when to break process or framework or something like that. And so I think that's the thing is, again, just getting back to that tension is like, how do PMs start to become better at what they do? And I by the way, I have like lots of ideas about that. Like I use something called decision forcing cases inside of Google to help train people through, which is a concept from the Marines and kind of military realm, but adopting them for product managers learn through group learning, for example. I think there's lots of ways for us to teach tacit knowledge without actually being and doing the thing. But that I think is going to be a really big tension in some way.
Great. Well, thanks, Chris.
Well done. Well, thank you everybody so much. Bye.
Appreciate that.